Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Let's get started. Welcome, everybody here in the room in London and everybody online to this panel discussion and launch event on the causes and consequences of Darfuri migration into Europe. We have an exciting panel for you today, including the authors of the report that you have in front of you, and there's some more copies outside, and also some other panelists from the Sudanese community here in the UK, and we have Dame Marsden, who was an official in Sudan for many years. I'll introduce them properly in a second. And just the reason that we were so interested in this study as the Humanitarian Policy Group is that, you know, for the first time, or there isn't much information about the specific experiences of specific migration groups, ethnic groups, migrating from their point of origin into Europe. And really looking at that whole process, from the reasons why they have moved, to the journeys that they made along the way, to their experiences once they get into Europe, and then what impact that migration has back home. And in the context of the fact that, in this particular case, Darfuris have a long history of migration. So looking at this almost from a systemic perspective and a kind of whole of process from origin to final destination. And this also was an important study for us because it's the subject of a collaboration between the Humanitarian Policy Group here at ODI and the Research and Evidence Facility led by SOAS here in London. We also benefited from a fantastic partnership, research partnership and in-kind support from Oxfam in Sudan, from SEDEJ, and from the Faculty of Economic and Social Sciences at the University of Khartoum. So really a very wide partnership here. We also would like to acknowledge the funders of this study, the EU Emergency Trust Fund for the Horn of Africa, as well as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands. So as I said, we have a fantastic panel for you. I am Christina Bennett. I'm the head of the Humanitarian Policy Group here at ODI. I am your chair. We have the two authors of this report, Margie Buchanan-Smith, far to my left. She's a senior research associate here at ODI and has been involved in the humanitarian aid sector for more than 20 years. Her current focus is Sudan, and particularly Darfur, where she worked in the 1980s, specializing in policy practice, livelihoods, and evaluations. She's currently also a visiting fellow at the Feinstein International Center at Tufts University outside of Boston. To my immediate left is Suzanne Jaspers, the co-author and co-researcher of this report. She is a research associate at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies here in London. She has 30 years of experience in research and operational work in the social and economic aspects of food security, and has just finished a PhD at Bristol University examining the history and politics of food aid in Sudan. Suzanne first worked in Darfur in 1989 and has continued to be engaged in that situation since then. To my immediate right is Mr. Zuhair Bashar. Mr. Bashar is currently an independent researcher with over 20 years of work experience in conflict resolution, conflict management, development, humanitarian, political affairs, and in the private sector, mainly in Africa and in the Middle East. Zuhair himself is a refugee from Sudan and a leader of a Sudanese community here in the UK in Bradford. And to my far right, we've got Dame Rosalind Marsden, an associate fellow at Chatham House, and from 2010 to 2013, the EU Special Representative for Sudan. Before joining the EU, Dame Marsden had a long career in the British Diplomatic Service, including postings as Consul General in Basra, as British Ambassador to Sudan, and British Ambassador to Afghanistan. So just as a bit of housekeeping, this is being recorded live, and the recording will be available in a few days' time. We will be tweeting, so the hashtag, I believe, is on the screen there. It's hashtag Darfur. Please follow us and tweet about the conversation that we're having in this room and any impressions you have of that conversation. We will be sort of having a bit of a panel discussion up here first. We will then turn it over to you, both here in the room and online, for some questions afterwards. I would just remind you to speak into the mic and identify yourself by your name and affiliation when you do. So let's get started. First, can I turn to Suzanne, who is going to present some aspects of the report, and specifically the aspects of the research that looked at why people move. So Suzanne, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So yes, I mean, maybe the first thing that I should say is that, when Margie and I were thinking about this, I mean, we wanted to do this study because our initial investigations had shown that, with the surge in migration to Europe, a large proportion were also Darfuris. But in fact, little was known about who was coming out into Europe and why, or even how. We also, in this research, looked at kind of how migration patterns built on those from the past. And again, Margie and I have been working in Darfur on and off since the 1980s. And of course, we knew that migration has been a kind of key part of Darfuri livelihoods for a very long time. Darfuris have migrated for a long time, particularly since the 60s and 70s, when, with drought, with economic crisis and famine. And this already included migration to Libya, to Egypt, to the Gulf countries. So this in itself is nothing new. But migration kind of changed dramatically from 2003, when conflict and counterinsurgency displaced, more than 2 million people. Now, the key thing here is that this has continued. I mean, if you think in 2017, there were still 1.6 million displaced people living in camps, 3.3 million in need of humanitarian assistance. So this is in fact the same number as, or similar numbers to those at supposedly the height of the humanitarian crisis in 2005. Now this graph shows the peak of Sudanese migration to Italy, which in 2014 and 2016. Now these are the kind of things that happened at the same time in Darfur. There was an increase in violence or violent conflict and displacement, specifically from 2013 with the creation of the Rapid Support Forces, which were kind of incorporate many of the kind of Arab militias that had been fighting alongside the government. At the same time, there was a kind of reduction in regional opportunities for migration. So, for example, there was conflict in South Sudan, so not possible to go there. In Chad, you would see kind of changes or closure of camps or reduction in services, civil war in Libya, political instability in Egypt. So within the region, the opportunities were very much reduced. And then, of course, you have the collapse of the Libyan state and the proliferation of smuggling networks. So what we're saying here is that, even though the numbers of Darfuris migrating to Europe, or even Sudanese in general, is small compared to the number of displaced within Darfur, this really kind of highlights or reflects a new phase in Darfur's humanitarian crisis. So in more detail, who migrates and why? Well, basically, it's mainly young men in their 20s and 30s, but also some which are kind of minors, sort of 14 to 15 years old when they leave Sudan. A really important thing is that the majority of people who migrate to Europe have a history of displacement. So either people will have grown up in a displaced camp, or they've been displaced multiple times already within the last 15 years. Most of them are quite poor, so they've been involved in kind of, maybe casual labor, kind of quite marginal activities, having to save money to at least make it to Libya or get money as a gift or a loan from friends. Working in gold mines was another kind of really important, what you could call an opportunity that came up from around sort of 2013-14. Most of them were also from the ethnic groups related to the rebellion, so Zarawa, Masalit, Fur, but also we found many other tribes also when we interviewed people in Europe. Now, what our study shows is that these people are facing ongoing attacks, harassment, surveillance, ill treatment, both in Darfur and in Khartoum. Displaced populations and students are particularly affected, and so attacks on camps in Darfur continue, and maybe say particularly here that they're just on under constant surveillance. So if anyone kind of, as particularly young man, moves out of the camp, he comes back and he's picked up, he's questioned, detained, sometimes even tortured. Arrest and ill treatment of students is also common, and also there is discrimination in finding employment. So basically this amounts to systemic persecution of particular population groups. The other thing is that loss of livelihoods, of course, because of protracted displacement, and social pressure were kind of contributing factors. So for many displaced, we found that their land remains occupied, or it is not safe to farm. And for many young men, not being able to fulfill their social obligations is really a source of major frustration and even shame. I mean, they can't, when you get older, you're supposed to be able to look after your family, you're supposed to be able to get married. And of course, receiving pictures from friends who have made it to Europe, whether on WhatsApp or Facebook, just makes the situation worse. So basically in Sudan, they had no hope of the situation getting any better. So what we found is this kind of deep sense of despair amongst young people in Darfur, and of people in Darfur and Sudan. And what this meant is that even though many of them knew the risks of especially crossing the Mediterranean, they basically told us they preferred a quick death in the Mediterranean to a slow death in Darfur. So the popular narrative is actually that the conflict is over and that remaining violence is due to crime and failures of police and justice system. So obviously our study contradicts these findings. It shows that conflict and violence continues, including attack, harassment, pervasive surveillance. I've mentioned all of these. And that smuggling and trafficking are not the causes of migration. They are facilitators, as shown in many other studies. And in fact, it's the closure of borders that has led to a proliferation of smuggling networks and, as Margie will say, increasing risks for Darfuris migrating. So the implications for the Khartoum process, first of all, the Khartoum process is the collaboration between the EU and countries in the Horn of Africa, particularly in Sudan, to manage migration. So basically collaborating with the Sudan government. The focus of the Khartoum process is very much on border management and smuggling networks for migrants migrating through Sudan. So obviously this does not address the causes of migration from Sudan, in particularly Darfuris. And what our study does is it provides evidence that this must be given greater attention. So because forced migration from Sudan is clearly a big issue, there really needs to be engagement on human rights with the government of Sudan, and some kind of any cooperation or collaboration with the Sudan government being conditional on ending this persecution of particular groups. Of course, this is going to take time. So in the meantime, I think maybe the first thing is just to make that problem visible. Which includes protection monitoring of IDPs, of students, and also kind of, liaising with the relevant authorities. Supporting livelihoods, we can talk about that in more detail maybe in the discussion. And the other thing is just to ensure that any aid programming is conflict sensitive. And I'll leave it at that.
Thanks very much, Suzanne, and thank you for painting a picture for us, both, countering the narratives that we all hear about, that the crisis is over in Darfur, no longer a need for humanitarian assistance there, but what you've documented is kind of what you call the systematic persecution of people there that's driving them out. And also, this picture of despair. And I remember when we were talking about the title of the report, and really wanting to emphasize that aspect, that sort of personal aspect, that sense of hopelessness that is making them leave. But maybe now turning to Margie, could you tell us a little bit about what happens when they do leave, and finally what their experience is like once they arrive in Europe, the Darfuris?
Yes, thank you very much. So yes, I'm going to pick up the story about what the experience is of Darfuris once they've left Sudan on their journey to get to Europe, and what happens once they reach Europe. So in some ways, their experiences are similar to migrants from other African countries. The slavery and exploitation they may experience in Libya, which has now been quite well documented, the extreme risks of crossing the Mediterranean. But what we think is different for Darfuri migrants is they're amongst some of the poorest of the African migrants coming to Europe, which means that some of those risks are exacerbated. So, for example, in coming through Libya, many of them are getting stuck in Libya for a couple of years because they don't have the money to pay their way through Libya. And so they're getting involved in slavery, bonded labor, kidnapping, and we've heard many cases of Darfuris who've been in Libya for 2 years or more. They also don't have the resources to pay smuggler networks, so their journeys through Europe may be delayed as a result of that. They may be put in the least seaworthy boats crossing the Mediterranean because of having more limited resources. So that's one of the things that we would like to kind of highlight about this particular group. We also think that they're amongst some of the most poorly educated migrants coming from Africa to Europe. And that shows up in a number of different ways, certainly through language skills. And the evidence once they reach Europe is actually they're quite poorly informed. And even though information is being made available to migrants, it doesn't seem to be getting through to this particular group. And instead, they're very much dependent on information that's passing from one Sudanese migrant to another. So it's quite dependent on hearsay. Everybody's getting the same information. And what they know about, for example, rights and asylum procedures in Europe is actually very limited. One of the other things, though, it may be worth pointing out that we've been very struck by in this research are the very strong support networks within or amongst the Sudanese migrants. So we've seen that on their journeys in the way that they're supporting each other. And then we've also seen that in the UK in terms of some of the community associations that have been set up amongst the newly arrived migrants and how they're supporting each other. And that again, seems to be a particular feature of this group. So let me say a little bit more about the journeys that people have taken. And I'm going to illustrate that with the example of one particular migrant who we interviewed in Belgium. So you've got the map on the screen here of the movements that he took from leaving Sudan. This all happened over the period of a year, from leaving Sudan, having been a student who'd been arrested, detained, imprisoned, and then decided to leave for his own safety. So he came overland through Libya, and as you can see from the arrows on the map, has moved through Europe back and forward in many different directions. And I just want to really draw your attention to three particular aspects of this journey. So, first of all, like many Sudanese migrants, his aim was to move through Italy fast, and he considered applying for asylum in France, but then realized that there were a lot of people living on the streets in France waiting to register their asylum claims. So at that point decided to move on to try and reach the UK, which he did from Calais, traveling illegally on a truck. And this is the second point that I wanted to raise about his particular experience. So once he reached the UK, he was then deported after about 10 months back to Italy as a result of the Dublin 3 regulations, because that's where he'd been registered as having arrived. So he then carried on didn't want to apply for asylum in Italy, moved back to France, and did apply for asylum, was waiting for a number of months, again, living on the streets, living rough, and so decided to move to Belgium to try to get to the UK once again. And this is really an example of these kind of circular movements that many Darfuri migrants are kind of stuck in, if you like, as they try to reach their final destination. The lack of trust in asylum procedures came through, the lack of assistance whilst awaiting for asylum, and a number of Darfuri migrants have told us about police violence that they've been subjected to in Italy, France, and in Belgium. So let me just say a little bit about European policies. So what's been the impact of European migration policies on this particular group of migrants, on Darfuri migrants? So what we're seeing is these like mini humanitarian crises across Europe, and particularly around borders, where borders have been closed, and you've got migrants kind of stuck on those borders trying to cross, and often living in very poor conditions with very limited assistance. And our observation in doing this research is the high proportion of Sudanese who are amongst those migrants stuck on the borders. So we saw this in Ventimiglia on the French-Italian border. We've seen it in Brussels and in Calais. Secondly, the impact of the Dublin III regulations. So, as I already mentioned, Darfuris are often trying to reach a country where they think they have the best chance of claiming asylum, and often where they've already got contacts and family members. And they're trying to move under the radar, undetected, in order to reach those countries. Now, that means, of course, they're undocumented, they're unregistered, so they're much more vulnerable to deportation and to being picked up and arrested in the process, and don't have access to protection, to relief assistance. Asylum procedures, I've already given examples of how those can be very slow, can be very inefficient, sometimes very unpredictable. And as from what Suzanne was saying, is evidence, and I think there's a lot of evidence in our report, of actually how a lot of Darfuri migrants have a very strong claim for asylum in Europe because of what they've experienced. And that doesn't always seem to be coming through in terms of how their asylum claims are being treated. Deportations is another point I wanted to draw attention to. So a number of European countries have either got formal agreements with the government of Sudan, for example, Italy, or informal agreements, which seems to have facilitated deportations of sometimes failed asylum claimants. Sometimes it's not even clear whether these are people who have claimed asylum or not. And some of those deportations back to Khartoum, they're not monitored when people are sent back to Khartoum, so we don't know what's happening to them. But again, the concern that we raise in this report is that the persecution is also happening of Darfuris in Khartoum. So claims that it's safe to send people back to Khartoum, we would challenge. But also just to say that some of the European governments that do have agreements with the government of Sudan, those agreements have enabled Sudanese government officials to come to those countries to screen some of the Sudanese who are on the verge of being deported, which is highly questionable when you look at some of the refugee conventions, European Convention on Human Rights, for example, that European governments are signed up to. Trauma, another point that we raise in the report that was very evident to us in doing this research, are the levels of trauma amongst Darfuri migrants. It's not surprising, given the experiences that they've had often in Sudan before they leave, coming through Libya, and then reaching a continent, Europe, where they think that their human rights are going to be respected, and then some of the experiences that they have in Europe. But our concern is that the trauma which comes through in many different ways is actually not being addressed. It's not being addressed whilst they're en route in transit, and it's also not being addressed when they reach their final destination, including here in the UK. So what does all of this mean? Well, what we draw attention to in this study is, first of all, what needs to change is we need to be providing adequate shelter, food and water for refugees in transit and for those waiting for their asylum claims to be considered in Europe. It's a lot of voluntary organisations are stepping into the breach, but it's really imperative that European governments fulfil their obligations on this. We would also add our voice to the calls to address inconsistencies in asylum regulations between European countries, European governments, and that there's a real need to increase burden sharing rather than expect that the countries of origin, the countries where migrants first arrive are going to process all the asylum claims. And the two other points that I've already made, that we do believe many Darfuris have a strong case for asylum because of what they've experienced in Sudan, and we also think there's a real need to provide much greater provision of treatment for trauma for Darfuris, both in transit and when they reach their destination. But above all, I think what our study reveals is this fundamental failure to protect. And that starts in Sudan. It's a fundamental failure to protect people who've been affected by the conflict, people who are living in IDP camps, students in Khartoum. And then it's a fundamental failure to protect as people are fleeing for their own safety along the route. So whether it's in Libya and even when they reach Europe. And that's one of the things that we really are trying to shine a spotlight on in this report. So thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Margie. And, again, a really vivid picture of what that journey from Darfur to various parts of Europe look like. And what you have on your chairs here in London is an executive summary of a fairly chunky report that has a lot of that vivid detail and a lot of evidence of all of this inside it. So I encourage you to go online for the full copy, for the full report, and really delve into some of that detail, because it's a really solid evidence base for this journey, this process, and this systemic persecution, which you both alluded to. Maybe just a quick question for you, Margie. I was struck by something you said about these kind of mini humanitarian crises on the borders between the different countries in Europe, and the fact that you said that you found a lot of Darfuris there. Yeah. What is it about the Darfuri experience in particular that puts them on these borders without an ability to move beyond them or without assistance?
Yeah, lack of resources is a big one, because if you've got money, then you've got a much better chance of finding a smuggler who'll take you across the border, and so that was absolutely a kind of fundamental issue. And the other thing which I didn't mention, which is also causing these mini humanitarian crises, is that a lot of local authorities are making it very difficult for voluntary groups to provide relief assistance and protection to migrants stuck in those border areas. And as I say, that's where we're seeing a high proportion of Sudanese.
Good, thank you. Maybe I'll turn to Zuhair. You are a Sudanese refugee yourself. You also are a community leader in helping others, other Sudanese refugees in Brantford, I believe, get beyond their experience of having come here. Does what, you've heard from your colleagues this picture of systemic persecution, of why people left Darfur in the first place. What can you talk about from your own experience or from those of the people that you work with? What does that look like to them? Is that something that resonates with you?
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to speak briefly about what underpinned my interest with regard to conflict in Darfur. So I'm originally from Darfur, and I have been studying the conflict in Darfur for a long time. I did my PhD on this issue, and also I have contributed to some studies on Darfur with some organizations like American NGO and also with University of Manchester, with whom I worked for 2 years. And again, I have contributed to this report as well as interpreter, as an interviewee, and as well as a report reviewer. So all this together, in addition to being a refugee from Darfur, that make me very much interested on the issue of Darfur and what the Darfurians have experienced here, whether in UK or back home. From my experience as a refugee, and from my experience working with Darfurian refugees here in the UK, I can talk about three major pushing factors that made the Darfurians to leave Darfur to come here. The first one is the persecution, and that the Darfurians have been badly treated in their home there. That's one thing. The other thing is, coincide with this kind of persecution and abusive and attack and all these things, the Darfurian lack protection, whether from the international community represented by UN mission in Darfur or later on by UNAMID. All these missions were unable to provide the expected protection from that the Darfuris were expecting from the international community, let alone from their own government. So that is another reason. The third reason is the unemployment and the destruction of the livelihood. The livelihood inside Darfur was completely destructed because of this attack, burning villages, attacking fields and crops and everything. And then all people move into urban centers or move into IDP camps. So with this situation, the youngest were trying to find another way to survive. So they moved from the camps inside Darfur to eastern part of Sudan, Khartoum, Durman, or wherever. And more students, according to some studies, the number of Darfurian students increased between 2003 upwards, because people found themselves sitting, doing nothing. They said it's better to go and join doing studies, especially postgraduate studies. But when they go there to the universities in Khartoum and other cities in the east and northern Sudan, they found another kind of discrimination and bad treatment. So now they found themselves blocked. So what the options left is to leave Sudan. So that is why most of the people who leave Sudan, the Darfuris who leave Sudan, are youngest people, because everything is blocked in front of them and they feel that there is no hope. So that is why they just leave Sudan to come here. That is with regard why people were coming here. After they came here, what is the situation? They came here, the first thing they face is a language barrier, because they have a very low education, and their education with regard to the English skills is very low too. That's because they have very low education, and because in Sudan there was a policy of Arabization whereby the English is no longer being a kind of an interest for the people, and the whole universities were being the language of instruction in the whole university was turned into Arabic language instead of English language in some universities. So they came here with no language skill, and they faced the situation here, and they found it very difficult to communicate. That's one thing. Another thing, they found the process, the procedures of the asylum process, for them is very difficult and not trusted. I think from my own experience and my contact with these people, they came loaded with some pre-ideas that governments do not do much to help people. So they apply what has happened in Sudan to what might be happen here in UK. So they are not trusting government procedures. Especially here in the UK, when you go, they will tell you go back home, we'll send you a letter on the post, and then your procedures will be followed. So they don't have trust on this at all. Let alone their information about this process and about the situation in the UK were very confusing. They have picked up this information through social media from their relatives who were living here, from their friends who were living here, and they don't have a very clear picture about what's going on here. So when they came here, they just find themselves in this kind of trapping, and they can't go further. So that is one thing. That is a problem in itself. But the challenge is how to cope with this situation and to get out of it. So the challenge of coping with the situation, coping with the life in the UK, that's another difficulty. Why? Because these people, when they arrive in the UK, they have been given accommodation. That's a good thing. And by the way, when you ask them about their experience in France or Italy or Belgium compared to UK, they will praise the situation in the UK. It's brilliant, the police treated them very well, they have been given accommodation and assistance very quickly. Yet, there are some problems of how to accommodate. There have been allocated houses in a very poor areas. And these poor areas are inhabited by, more likely, by migrants, whether from Africa, from some Arab countries, or from Asian background people. And these people themselves are struggling. They have no room to help others. So they are struggling with the language, they are struggling with the life, they are struggling with everything. And within this situation, the Sudanese seem to make their own pockets within this segregatory residential system. So they have made their own pockets, and this is not going to help because in most time they talk to one another in their Arabic language or the Sudanese language, and they can't learn more about the English language and about the situation here, and they don't have a direct touch with the original people of this country, at least to borrow from them how they can behave, how they can pick up some kind of life here in this country. So that is another problematic issue. How to get out of this, it continues with them up to now. Another issue is what I would call, and actually it was called by the Theresa May, hostile environment for the migrants. I think that hostile environment policy that adopted by the British government in 2012, and it was initiated by Theresa May. At that time she was, I think, the Home Office Secretary. This hostile environment towards the migrants had made the situation more worse, meaning that there was a cut in the funds, and there was a reduction in the assistance that provided to the refugees. I will give only one example. There is a center in Bradford called Bradford Refugee Action, whereby people go there, the refugee and asylum seeker go and seek for assistance, whether to apply for benefit or to seek a legal assistance and legal advice, and so on and so forth. That center in 2012 up to 2013 was full of advisors, legal advisors and other advisors who can give advice to the refugees and the migrants. By now, there is only one advisor, and she works only once a week. And 4 or 5 years ago, there were 5 advisors who worked 5 days a week. So look at that. Another implication of the hostile environment policy was cutting the assistance for the refugees. Refugees used to be paid some money for their livelihood, for transport and others. That money was cut off by about 50%. and now they are living for about 35 pounds a week, including living expense, transport, and everything. This made people just confine themselves to home because they don't have money to go outside. They don't have money to pay for taxi or bus to go outside. They don't have money to go to cinema, to go to theater, to go for entertainment. So they just keep at home. Keeping at home duplicate the depression and the flashback that in their head. And that will lead me to go to the issue of trauma. They have already come to this country loaded with trauma because of the treatment that they have received in their own country, in addition to what they have undergone through Libya and France, Italy, and so on. And when they arrive here, they have that kind of trauma, but they are not aware of it. And now by this policy on confining and separation, isolation, and sitting alone, that have been exaggerated, and people became more nervous, depressed, and it led to a kind of domestic violence. People, wife and husband become so angry and arguing, and sometimes it led to clash between them. Mom and dad sometimes are angry and they just put that on their kids. Maybe they punish the kids, or they speak abusive language, or loudly, or bullying the kids. And all these problems we have faced on the real world. For example, when a few years after just 1 year after I finished my PhD, I thought about an idea to help Sudanese refugees. And with others, about a dozen of people, men and women, we came together to organize something called Sudanese Community in Bradford. We only formed that kind of organization to try to help each other, to come together, to have space where we can sit, and then you can talk to one another, and if someone needs help, we can intervene and help them. We help them with interpretation, we help them with filling in forms for benefits, we help them to read the letters that they receive from the Home Office, we help them to direct them to service providers and their locations and this and that. So with having this Sudanese community in Bradford, people have the confidence to come and talk to me as a chairperson of that organization. And slowly, I build trust with people, men and women, so they come to approach me and to talk about their difficulties and differences at home and how we can mediate that. So I have been involving in mediating a lot of conflicts between husband and wives, and sometimes we are able to resolve that. In most cases, we are able to resolve it. In some cases, we are not able, and they refer it to the police. And sometimes the police come back to ask us to intervene if the two parties, of course, agreed to that. And with this kind of intervention, I get to know a lot about what's going on and what has happened to these people and what kind of trauma they are suffering. So I will finish my my intervention with one point that is related to the problem of this trauma and how people can deal with it. There is no much support from the government. There is no much support from the organizations because they say they do lack support, they do lack fund, especially the clinics, and there is no counseling. The people are not aware to where they can go, and we left as if we were to take this burden as community, and we don't have the experts, we don't have the expertise, we don't have the resources, and we ourselves suffering because we are refugees too, and we have our own problems. So I think that is the point where the government need to revisit their policies, especially the what's so-called the hostile environment policy, and look for a genuine support for a qualified organizations that can tackle this issue of trauma and help the refugees and asylum seekers. Sudanese and other asylum seekers alike. And this kind of problems are similar within all other communities. I have been dealing with Arabs, I have been dealing with some Asians, I have been dealing with other Africans and Sudanese, so they all share this kind of problems. Thank you.
Thanks, Zuhair, for that. And it was something I really wanted to ask you about, was this issue of trauma, because Margie, we talked about it, and it's talked about in the report, and you've raised it as part of the work that you do with your community in Bradford. But as you say, it's not necessarily your responsibility. It's not the responsibility of the community itself to be dealing with such high levels of trauma. And it's fantastic that you've got a community support group, but that the UK government, or at least the local council, somebody should be helping to support what you're trying to do. And I wondered if you could just, let us know what it is, what would be the one thing that the government could do, either through the hostile environment policy or otherwise, to help support what you're trying to do at a community level.
I think two steps the government can do. One step is to have a package of induction that should include the issue of trauma for the newcomers, asylum seekers and refugees. Because they came here, they have the trauma, they don't know about it. So if someone has the expertise and come in this package of induction, and this, I would say this induction should be a compulsory, because when people came for the first time, they were assigned to support workers or some organizations to help them. That organization or support worker should include this issue of trauma into their program and give a comprehensive induction about the diagnosis and the kinds of issues that could come up with the trauma, depression, what depression means, and also to tell people that it's not an issue that to be hide, because back home in Sudan, when you associate issue of mental health to person, that's the kind of stigma. So that's why people don't want to come up and tell about it. So you have to raise their awareness that this is not a stigma, this is a normal thing like a physical illness or anything. That's one point. The other point is to provide genuine counseling side by side at the GPs. At least I would not say every GP should have a counseling department, but at least 3-4 GPs should have a counseling department there for the people to access and to have counseling, and to talk about their concerns in this regard.
Thank you very much, Zuhair. Dame Marsden, hi. You've heard from all three of our speakers what has been termed in the report, and certainly has been evidenced, at least in this discussion, as a sort of widespread failure to protect Darfuris, both at home and once they get here. And here in a country and in Europe, the sort of, the nexus of some of the most progressive refugee and human rights conventions that we have in this world. So, what do you, from your perspective, how should we in the UK or in Europe be dealing with this hypocrisy?
Well, thank you. And to start with, I wanted to say that I very much agree with the findings and recommendations in this report, which I think is an extremely good report. There are one or two other political considerations I would like to add, but perhaps I can come back to that in a moment. On the question you asked, I think the first point I'd make is that the UK has been traditionally respected by many Sudanese people because of its perceived values of respect for human rights, justice and democracy, and the same goes for the EU as a whole. And while recognising the domestic political pressures on European governments over this migration issue, I think it's really important to find a way of dealing with the issue humanely if Europe is not to be seen as betraying these very values that it stands for. And there is a real risk of this happening if migrants become disillusioned by the way they're treated during the asylum process or on the journey, or indeed by security forces once they get to Europe. So I think this means doing two things. The first of which is to do much more to address the root causes of conflict and the drivers of migration at source. And that's partly to do with trying to achieve a revitalised peace process. But that all of that could take some time, and in the meantime, I think it's really important to do more to focus on the protection aspects. And the issues I would particularly highlight, which are brought out in the report, I think, first of all, the lack of legal migration channels which are accessible to Darfuris means they have to depend, obviously, on smuggler networks which are exposed to all the risks that involves. And I think according to IOM's latest figures, which came out in the last few days, over 1,500 migrants are known to have drowned in the Mediterranean this year alone. Secondly, the Europe's emphasis on deterrence and border closure means compromising the safety of migrants, and as we've seen, particularly from a recent CNN documentary, the appalling conditions that some Darfuris have had to live in Libya, where they've been detained or enslaved. Then thirdly, and I think Margie referred to this, I'm concerned about that failed Darfuri or unsuccessful Darfuri asylum seekers have been returned to Sudan by some European governments with little or no follow-up. And given Sudan's human rights record and the absence of any mechanism to monitor what happens to these people post-deportation, I think that's an issue of real concern, and it would be important to encourage European member states to take more responsibility to try to find ways of monitoring the welfare of asylum seekers if they are returned. There's also, as was mentioned, the very worrying trend to allow Sudanese officials access to screening Sudanese refugees on the verge of being deported, which obviously exposes them to risks on their return. And then finally, on the protection side, the concern about the very slow asylum process in the UK, where asylum seekers often have to wait years for their claims to be processed, can face multiple rejections, and during all this time they're not allowed to work, which is a real problem. And they also face the threat, of course, of being kept in detention centres for indefinite periods. So these are some of the issues I think I would certainly highlight on the protection side.
Thank you. Maybe just coming back to your point about the mechanism to monitor people post-deportation. What do you feel is the responsibility of European governments or the UK government in monitoring people post-deportation, and how does this fit into some of the wider global processes that are ongoing?
Well, as far as I understand it, I don't think governments have I don't think they have a legal obligation to do this under refugee law. But clearly, in a country like Sudan, given what we know anecdotally and so forth about the human rights situation, I would have thought it was important to try and make a special effort to devise some sort of network, maybe working with local Sudanese civil society organisations and possibly others, to see if some more systematic attempt can be made to find out what happens, because I think that's really important as an input to Home Office policy making.
Did you want to, I heard some murmurings over here. Did you have any thoughts, Suzanne or Margie, on this and what you feel government responsibility is in this regard?
I think both. Well, I mean, like Marsden says. I mean, there is no mechanism for doing this. I mean, I remember talking about it to UNHCR in Khartoum, and they said no one's asked us to monitor. I mean, basically nobody knows. Not UNHCR, not IOM. Nobody knows what happens to people who are returned to Sudan. So, yeah, I fully agree that that's needed.
And then, Dame Marsden, you also talked about a revitalized peace process in Sudan. And certainly a lot of what this study says is that, we really should be looking at tackling the root causes of why people leave in the first place. But given your experience as an EU and a British official in Sudan, what do you feel, what are the terms for some kind of engagement or dialogue with the government of Sudan on this issue at this point?
Well, I think that the issue of migration can't be addressed through security measures alone. I think that's clear, and the focus at the moment of fighting human trafficking and migrant smuggling networks just looks like tackling the symptoms rather than the causes of the problem. And I think in the report, it was also noted that although support for livelihoods is indeed sorely needed, as long as migrants are fleeing from violence and repression, livelihood support alone is also not going to address the problem. So the only effective way of reducing the flow of migrants over time is to do more to end Sudan's internal conflicts, and to try to make progress on peace and democratic transformation so that would-be migrants can enjoy safety and freedom and livelihood opportunities in Sudan. And I'm concerned that if UNIMIT, for example, were to leave Darfur in 2020, which is the current plan, and if the government of Sudan were to pursue plans to close the camps for displaced people in Darfur, then actually the European Union and its member states could face a further wave of migrants coming towards its borders. So I think all these political issues have to be looked at as a whole. Now, on the peace process, I think my recommendation would be that the UK and the European Union, working in coordination with international partners, should make a real effort to redouble diplomatic efforts. I hate to use the word revitalise because that's been used with South Sudan, but for the lack of a better word, to sort of re-energise the AU-led Sudan peace process, which is being chaired by President Mbeki, which has been relatively dormant or stalled for quite some time, and to apply more pressure on the government of Sudan. I mean, of course, on all the parties to the conflict, but especially the government. So I think more political engagement by the UK and the EU is needed. The EU is providing funding for the African Union mediation panel, but funding isn't enough. So the next sort of following on from that, I think, therefore, any move by the UK or other member states to cooperate more closely with the government of Sudan, or by the United States to remove Sudan from its list of state sponsors of terrorism, or eventually to grant debt relief by the Paris Club, I think all that should be conditional on substantial fundamental progress on peace, democratisation and respect for human rights. And a transparent conditions-based approach should also be the basis of the UK-Sudan strategic dialogue. So essentially, as the report rightly says, human rights should be at the heart of the EU's engagement with the Sudanese government.
And do you think that concessions like removing the Sudanese government from the list of, from the list in the United States, or the list of sanctions in the United States, or else, favorable trade terms or favorable lending terms, is that enough to get the government of Sudan to the table on these?
Well, the government of Sudan is very keen to see itself removed from the US list of state sponsors of terrorism. What we know is, I think, the US government is hoping to embark on a second phase of engagement with the government of Sudan over this issue. The first phase resulted in Sudan's removal from, the lifting of US economic sanctions on Sudan last year. So this would be the second phase. And what that means is, I think, that at the moment the US government has probably got more leverage on Sudan as a result of that than perhaps the European governments have. So I think that gives them the ability to set some fairly far-reaching conditions. And I think if steps were taken to try and end the conflicts and to put pressure on the government to improve space for political space, then that would contribute to an environment which would also help to address the migration issue.
Okay, thank you. And thanks to our panel. I think we've had a fantastic discussion up here. I want to then turn it over to all of you and those of you who are listening watching online. But before I open it up to questions, I wanted to give the floor to Oliver Bakewell, who's a colleague sitting here in the corner, who is the research coordinator on migration and development for the research and evidence facility of that has sponsored this report. And we've been talking very specifically about Darfur up here, but you have commissioned a number of different pieces of research dealing with other populations in similar circumstances. Does this discussion resonate with you and the other research that the REF has commissioned?
Thanks very much. Thank you for this study, and thanks for the presentations. Just to explain, the Research and Evidence Facility is a slightly unusual group. It's a consortium led by SOAS with the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester and Sahan Research in Nairobi. And we've got funding from the EU Trust Fund to commission research relating to their activities. So we're funded by the Commission, by the Trust Fund, but we're able to do independent research, which means we're able to put out some quite critical pieces looking at different aspects of the work of the EU within the Horn of Africa, so it's particularly on the Horn of Africa. So this report is the first one which we've been involved in, which has actually taken us outside of the Horn and actually looked at the whole process of movement to Europe. So in terms of the comparison or the points of resonance, it's more about the issues of movement within the Horn. And a few things come out. Firstly, it's very striking that here we see Sudan is presented as a country, as a sending country. And I think that point hasn't really come across so far in the discussion, where so often in the discussion, Sudan, I think, positions itself and is often seen and presented as if it's all about transit. And it reminds us that there is so much mobility across the Horn, and it is, every country is receiving, sending, people are moving through. And so it starts to break down some of those categories. The other thing is the relationship between mobility and livelihoods is so fundamental. We've been doing research on cross-border mobility and livelihoods and seen how much movement across the region. It's irregular. It may be sometimes facilitated by smugglers, but it's fundamental to the way people live. So particularly thinking of movements between Ethiopia and Sudan, where hundreds of thousands are going to work in the labour market in Sudan. And those movements, there's questions arise about how far these things, what migration management means in those sorts of contexts, and how far the categories of irregular, regular migration necessarily make sense. It also, as we've seen, the historical perspective from Darfur, it's livelihoods in the area have been based on mobility. And there is a caution there which comes across in a lot of our research about thinking that solve the conflict in Sudan, improve the quality of people's access to rights, you will still have large volumes of movement and potentially increased volumes of movement. But it's going to be a different quality of movement. And I think that's really important. Very often there's concern about migration management and about tackling the root causes of irregular migration, and that's often problematic, and forced migration. And it's often elided into this expectation that's tackling the root cause of migration. And migration is essential to the way people live, the way all of us live. So we've got that sort of caution coming across in a lot of our work. Just one other point which I found really interesting in the report, it hasn't been mentioned yet, is this, the way that the young Darfuris are dealing with risk and making their decisions about moving. And it's the report mentions that young people are making, they're not moving with the blessing of their family. They're making their own way without telling their families. That echoes findings we had from a study of movement between the Horn of Africa and Yemen. And what I've wondered, and it's maybe a question, but it's also an important point when it comes to the policies that are adopted, about how people look at risk. Because young people we were hearing from there, the young Somalis on a very convoluted trip to Europe knew about the dangers they faced. They deliberately left without telling their families, with the expectation their families would then pay a ransom when they're in trouble. So it's something that the risk was embedded in their decision making. I'm curious to know if that was happening. I think the Somalis we were talking to maybe had more resources. But whether you see any of that sort of, the way that risk is incorporated within the movement, which challenge maybe some of the ways we think about tackling with information campaigns or telling people about risk, the fact there's risk actually makes it possible for people to go against their parents' wishes. I'll stop there so the floor can be open.
Thank you for those insights and for those questions. Let me just take a couple more questions in the room, and then maybe I'll ask you to reflect on what Oliver has said and some others. Please, yes, go ahead in the front row.